Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Sheri Berman. She's a professor of political science at Barnard College at Columbia University. And today we're talking about topics like the history of the political left, social democracy, labor movements, the rise of and the maintenance of democracy, capitalism, and also the recent rise of right-wing populism and fascist movement. So, Dr. Berman, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
I'm happy to be here.
So, starting with the left, then tell us a little bit about, of course, we have to be brief here because we don't have 10 hours to talk about the entire history of the left, but tell us a little bit about its origins historically and what, at least originally, was its main ideology.
So thanks. That's a great question, and thanks for starting us off by saying that answering it would probably take us 10 hours or more.
Yeah.
Entire libraries obviously have been written on this topic, but if we were to oversimplify, which obviously one has to do in this kind of context, I mean the origins of the left, the modern left, have to do with capitalism. I mean, obviously the terms left and right come from the French Revolution, but when we think of the left today, what we're really thinking about are the political parties, the labor movements that arose in the second half of the 19th century. And really, they rose to deal with the consequences or the implications of capitalism. So the history of the left and the history of capitalism have always been intertwined. The most important figure, obviously, in this history is Karl Marx as what became the sort of main thinker and the main ideology of the left in the, again, second half of the 19th century and the 20th century. And so beginning really, around this time, what you had were people, movements who were really grappling with how to think about where capitalism was going and what to do about it, primarily, but not exclusively, through the lens of Marx's and Engels' writings and the people who interpreted those writings. So what we have basically by the turn of the century, the end of the 19th and 20th century, is this ideology having become dominant within the international left. Europe primarily was the sort of main ground for debate, were people who were beginning actually to question some of the tenets of Marxism. And so what you see then is debates about what the future of capitalism is going to be and what should be done about it. And the international, what is that point, the international socialist movement begins to develop some very interesting cleavages and divides that we can actually still see echoes of in the left today. And so what were those cleavages? The first was about how to think about capitalism's development. That is to say, was it kind of doomed to failure because it was so horrible and was producing so many internal contradictions and negative consequences that it could not persist through time and should not persist through time? Or was it possible to kind of harness capitalism's upsides while minimizing its downsides? So one really important cleavage that begins to define the left from the late 19th century on is how to think about capitalism. Can it or should it be salvaged? What can or should be done to deal with it? And then the second really important cleavage related to, but somewhat different, is about political power. So originally, the Marxist version of capitalism's development was kind of inexorable. It was without a significant emphasis on human agency. Capitalism's internal contradictions were going to lead to certain kinds of developments, and political parties and social movements were really there to kind of educate the masses, to some degree, perhaps ameliorate consequences. But the ultimate driving force of history was economic development, the development of capitalism. And a lot of people found that very dispiriting and also very unhelpful. And so another split that comes up within the international socialist movement is how much emphasis to place on political power. And so we get a bunch of interesting cleavages based on these two things. We get Leninists, for instance, who believe that capitalism is terrible, needs to be overthrown, but that it has to be done through political power because it's not going to happen on its own. We get other people who think capitalism is terrible and it might not be collapsing today, but it will collapse eventually. And it's really the job of, socialists to kind of wait around for this to happen again and sort of, ameliorate perhaps some of its negative consequences. In the interim, those were the people who became sort of socialists, democratic socialists, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. You also had the people who would become social democrats who believed something quite different about capitalism. They believed, as I said, that it could be harnessed, that its upsides could be maximized and its downsides could be minimized. But in order to do that, socialists, people on the left, had to capture the democratic state. So they, oddly enough, agreed with Leninists that political power was central to the left, but they disagreed with Leninists in that they saw that political power as being embedded in a democratic state, that they could use the democratic state to control capitalism, again, to sort of get its good sides and minimize its downsides. So by the early 20th century, basically what we have are the three camps within the left that would determine it or shape it or characterize it during the 20th century. You got communists, Leninists, you got socialists, and you got social democrats. And they all come from this same original movement. They're all founded in a grappling with Marxism, but they come to very different conclusions, as I said, both about how to understand capitalism and its development and what should be done about it. And we're continuing to grapple with these questions, same questions about capitalism and democracy today.
By the way, let me ask you, particularly during the 20th century, because you mentioned Marx there and you focused a lot on the ending of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. But do we know to what extent the communist revolution in Russia and then the Soviet Union influenced how the left in general looks at and thinks about Marx and particularly communism, since, we know how it worked out and was applied in Russia and the Soviet Union. Were there among leftists reactions to that? Because, in a sense, after the rise of the Soviet Union and then later its fall, by then people would at least point or have something to point at when it comes to perhaps making claims about what would happen if communism or perhaps socialism, because sometimes even distinguishing communism from socialism is a bit tricky in a way also, because even within Marxist ideology, let's say, and even in the words of Marx himself, there was an initial phase that would be socialism, and then communism would come later on. How did the left react to all of what happened in the Soviet Union with, let's say, applied communism, if we could call it that?
So that's a great question, and also a very big one. At this point, in the sort of first quarter of the 21st century, it's really almost impossible to separate interpretations of Marxism from the real existing communism that we had in the Soviet Union or China. Now, there is a very long and heated debate that went on among leftist scholars about whether or not real existing communism reflected what Marx either wanted or predicted. He was a thinker, he was an intellectual, he was not a leader of a political movement. He wasn't around to see how the Soviet Union or China or other communist countries developed. So, we don't know what he would have thought and, what he would have preferred, but it's very hard today to separate, Marx from those things, which is in some ways unfair, but it's just, it's kind of the reality of the way history had developed. And there's also, of course, it's also very important to note that once the Soviet Union was formed, the access that people had to Marx's writings was also very much shaped by that, because, of course, the communists were very eager to put out, Marx's writings, but they emphasized some of his writings more than others. Whatever the later Marx, the more deterministic Marx, as opposed to the more humanistic Marx. But those are debates perhaps that scholars, have had and will continue to have. I think, what we know now, right, is that the Soviet Union and communist China, by eliminating democracy alongside eliminating capitalism, created pathologies that were certainly, I would say, worse than the original pathologies created by capitalism itself. And so, that has kind of, to a large degree, discredited that particular strand of leftist thinking. I think there are very few people these days who want to go back to communism as it existed, although there are obviously very many people who still believe capitalism is evil. It cannot be modified in any significant way and has to be gotten rid of. But fortunately, there are not that many people around advocating the kind of violent revolutionary overthrows that someone like Lenin or Mao engaged in. When the Soviet Union was formed after the Russian Revolution, of course, it transformed the international left, most practically because communist parties formed in almost all countries during that interwar period. And these communist parties were not only obviously opposed to capitalism, but they were also opposed to democracy. And so in Europe, for instance, communist parties during the interwar years very much worked to undermine democracy, often engaging in sort of violent uprisings, and were therefore complicit in, the downfall of democracy in many European countries. So the communism very much a sort of, an incredibly important part of the left's story during the 20th century and grappling with its legacy after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And, even earlier, the revelation of the crimes that were committed in the Soviet Union and China really shaped the way the left evolved. And communist parties in Europe, for instance, that, existed during the post-war period, having to deal with those crimes of the Soviet Union over the course of the post-war period did, for the most part, moderate. That's why we got sort of a Euro-communist movement in Western Europe, and these parties, sort of drew away from the violent, anti-democratic, imperialist nature of the Soviet Union and tried to find some kind of way to stay true to their opposition to capitalism, but jettison, again, the sort of anti-democratic, violent, and imperialist parts of what real existing communism looked like. That ended up being a sort of dead end. That movement ended up, sort of going nowhere. But it has been to some degree looked back towards by people today on the left who really feel that that capitalism cannot and should not be allowed to persist, but they're not interested again in the sort of violent, anti-democratic, imperialist aspects of what real existing communism turned into.
So among the three strands of leftism that you identified that came out of the 19th century, namely socialism, Marxist, communism, and social democracy, would you say that at least nowadays the main one among leftists would be social democracy, or not?
Well, so I would say it depends a little bit on the part of the world you're looking at. If we stick to Europe, for example, social democracy ended up being the sort of dominant strand on the left during the post-war period. That is to say, a kind of social democratic worldview ended up being the dominant one within most European left parties during the post-war period. That is to say, an acceptance of capitalism combined with a recognition of its dangers and downsides,
Right.
and this commitment to democracy, right? And a belief that these things could go together, right? That by gaining power in the democratic state, you could really mitigate all of these terrible consequences of capitalism. Now, of course, during the late 20th century, this view or this vision or this perspective began to kind of weaken and almost disappear as many of these parties kind of moved so far to the center on economics, kind of adopting, what came to be known as whatever third wayism in Europe, progressive neoliberalism in the United States, and that kind of vision of, look, it is really important for the left to remain cognizant of capitalism's downsides, even as they accept that they are no longer committed to destroying it, right? And they moved so far towards accepting a view of capitalism as relatively beneficent and efficient, the idea that many of its downsides had kind of whatever disappeared or were no longer relevant, that they kind of lost that part of what social democracy in any case meant, right? Which was that it not only accepted capitalism, but it also accepted how important it was to keep it sort of constrained. And so that social democratic vision, weirdly enough, began to dissipate after the collapse of the Soviet Union took down with it, adherence to old-fashioned communism. So what the left stands for now is very unclear, because the collapse of communism and the incredible weakening or watering down of social democracy has now left the left, so to speak, without a very clear profile, a defining stance towards capitalism, which has always been, to mix metaphor, to get back to what we talked about initially, it's raison d'etre, right? I mean, this is what the left is about. The left is about grappling with capitalism, but that aspect of its essence really, as I said, became watered down or dissipated by the end of the 20th century.
So, and as you described earlier, in the 19th century, leftism was very much tied to labor movements, workers' rights, stuff like that. So, but nowadays, how does social democracy relate to labor movements and things like syndicalism? Because particularly since you mentioned there, with the rise of perhaps progressive neoliberalism in the US and the third way in the UK and a little bit across Europe. I mean, it seems that labor movements, labor rights, syndicalism, and so on are no longer at least at the forefront of at least the social democracy, right?
Sure. So, I mean, at the same time as you were seeing the growth of left political parties, late 19th century, 20th century, you were seeing the growth of labor movements overall, most importantly represented by unions as well, right? So unions and left parties grew up together. Often the left parties grew out of unions and they interacted with and cooperated with each other sort of throughout this time. And during the last decades, at the same time as parties of the left have declined, so have labor unions and the other, organizations, civil society organizations that would have encompassed the labor movement. And those things obviously go together. I mean, the weakening of the left and the weakening of labor movements are part and parcel of the same trend, and they feed into each other, right? Left parties have always depended, for instance, on unions for mobilization, for the creation of working class identities. In the past, also often for their very leaders. And so, these kinds of things are part of a larger trend. They are also related to some obviously very important social and demographic changes. The number of traditional working class people has declined during the late 20th and early 21st century as capitalism changed, right? We have fewer, sort of large factories, and industry is a less important part of Western economies than it would have been. So what we've seen in its place is the rise of service sector industries, which often do not have better working conditions or wages than industrial workplaces had, but differ very much in the kinds of experiences that people who work within them have. And so traditional union organizing was designed, again, for an industrial workplace, not for people who are working in retail stores, fast food outlets, who are low-level workers in offices. And so, as the economy changed, labor movements did not change. And so they began also to kind of lose their hold over populations. And so union density levels are just a fraction in many European countries of what they were during the post-war decades. And all of these things have really fed into each other to diminish the power of the left, diminish the power of workers broadly defined in the economy, and to really change the dynamics of capitalism, because the countervailing force of the unions and left parties is just not as strong as it was during the post-war decades.
And particularly with progressive neoliberalism, I mean, I find it very interesting how there's a progressive strand of neoliberalism, because looking back historically in terms of what the left stood for, I mean, when neoliberalism we associate with the regulation of the market, with weakening of workers' rights, with precarization of of working conditions and all of that. So, I mean, how is it that we nowadays can have among leftists something that apparently runs counter to what the left historically stood for?
So, I mean, that is a really great question. I mean, from the perspective of 2024, it can be a little hard to understand why the left moved so far away from its traditional wariness of capitalism. And I say that just because we've had a financial crisis, we've now had growing inequality, we can see the fallout from inequality, from insecurity, from all of these things, right? And so with the benefit of hindsight, it looks like that move was just an incredibly wrong-headed one. I think if we go back to the 1990s, though, we can sort of understand, not excuse maybe, but understand why that move seemed to make sense to people at the time. I would say two things were really crucial. One was, of course, that Western economies did experience some real problems in the 70s and 80s. Inflation, slowed growth, rising unemployment. And so the traditional kind of economic measures that the left had relied on just were not as effective as they had been during the post-war decades. So there's absolutely that. And that in turn fed the rise of kind of neoliberal ideas, neoliberal movements, neoliberal thinkers, because they could look to these problems and say, look, we have ideas about how to solve these, and these old left ideas are no longer viable. And then the collapse of the Soviet Union really kind of created this triumphalism about liberal democratic capitalism, this belief not only that it had obviously succeeded where its main competitor had failed, but that success reflected its inherent stability and its inherent ability to kind of overcome crises. And so, this combination of problems with post-war policies and ideas and the sort of triumphalism that accompanied the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think really convinced many leaders on the left that they could abandon some of their wariness of capitalism, accept some of these neoliberal ideas about, capitalism's effectiveness, its ability to kind of solve its own problems and create sort of equilibria and stability, the need for less state intervention, less state regulation. And so again, the 90s were a very different time than the 2020s are. But as we can see in retrospect, these ideas turned out to be very wrong-headed. Wrong-headed because they've created huge economic problems for sure. I mean, we can draw a line from the neoliberalism of the 1990s right through the financial crisis, growing inequality, growing insecurity, divergences within economies, growing divergences within economies between rural and urban areas, all of these economic problems. And then, of course, a whole variety of political problems as well, because those economic problems, alongside a bunch of other things, really lie at the root of growing dissatisfaction with democracy and the increasing success of populism.
So let's talk about democracy then. How do you look at the current state of democracy? And perhaps here we can perhaps talk about two different, about democracy in different parts of the world, like old democracies, like the ones in the US and Western Europe particularly, and new democracies, particularly the ones that arose during the third wave in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. So tell us a little bit about that.
So the collapse of the Soviet Union brought a whole bunch of changes. We talked about one, it facilitated or propelled the rise of neoliberalism. But the other change that it brought, perhaps the most obvious change, is obviously all of these countries that had been part of the Soviet Empire were granted independence and became, at least initially, democracies. Eastern Europe, for example, parts of Central Asia, all of these places. So we got a huge wave of democratization at the end of the 20th century. Political scientists call it the third wave of democratization, to sort of give it some historical reference to earlier times when you had large numbers of countries making transitions to democracy at the same time. So we have a huge number of countries that make transitions to democracy at the end of the 20th century in Europe and elsewhere. And, some of these countries do well and others do less well. I mean, one of the things we know from previous waves is that many new democracies don't succeed. That's one of the reasons we call them waves, not only to kind of get you to think about a lot of things happening at the same time, but because all waves have undertows, right? And so, we expect that a lot of new democracies will not succeed because they don't have the, whatever you want to call them, conditions or prerequisites for democratic success. And in particular, countries that have not had experience with democracy in the past, that don't have legacies that they can build on, those tend to be particularly vulnerable. So even in places like Portugal and Spain, which made transitions during the third wave, although not obviously as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union, these cases were more successful. There's lots of reasons for that. But one is that they had some experience with democracy in the past. And so that not only meant they could learn lessons from the mistakes, but there was some history of political parties, a free press, independent civil society that they could look back and build upon. This was not true for the countries of Eastern Europe. They had no real experience with democracy and frankly, very little experience being independent countries at all. They formed after the collapse of empires at the end of the First World War, and then they were very quickly absorbed under Nazi rule and then into the Soviet Empire. So these countries make transitions to democracy at the end of the 20th century without previous democratic experience and also having to grapple with the challenges of independent existence, right? National sovereignty, who's a member of the nation, all those kinds of things. So, that a lot of these countries in Eastern Europe, like many new democracies, turn out to have some real problems should not surprise us. It should sadden us, but it should not really surprise us. I think what is most worrying to scholars who study democracy today is not the fact that many new democracies have proven weak and vulnerable. Again, that saddens us, but from a comparative and historical perspective does not surprise us. What is somewhat surprising is that many long-established democracies, like the one that exists in the United States and like those in Western Europe, have experienced some real problems, particularly in the United States, which almost every scholar who studies democracies thinks is in much worse shape than Western Europe as far as democracy is concerned. And that is somewhat new. Democracy was considered secure in the United States, not complete. Obviously, there were always lots of problems with our democracy, but not vulnerable to backsliding or significant democratic erosion. And in fact, it has proven to be vulnerable to these things. And this is somewhat surprising and therefore worrying and puzzling to scholars of democracy.
So, something that I find a bit confusing, particularly here in Europe, is why, particularly after the financial crisis of 2008, there's been a rise of right-wing populism, but we haven't seen the same on the other end. I mean, on the other side, on the left. I mean, do we have any idea why that's the case?
So that is a puzzle, and one that other social scientists have tried to explain. Given the incredible suffering caused by the financial crisis, one might have predicted that that suffering, so to speak, would benefit the left, because obviously the cause of it was neoliberalism, unconstrained capitalism, yada yada. And in fact, what we've seen is just the opposite, that it's not been the left that has benefited, but the populist, even far right. Now, what are the reasons for this? One is probably the reason that we talked about before, which is that the left had become so disassociated with a wariness of capitalism, a critique of capitalism, and frankly, in both Europe and the United States, implicated in many of the neoliberal reforms that were seen as having led directly to that financial crisis, that people did not see the left as a solution to the problems that were revealed by the financial crisis, but very much implicated in causing it. And I think there is a lot of truth to that. There's simply no doubt that left-wing parties, as we talked about, had advocated and in many cases implemented many of the changes and reforms that helped to cause the financial crisis. And so it was very hard for them to legitimately claim to voters that they were the best solution to a problem that they themselves had helped cause. Not exclusively, of course, but had helped cause. And so we can see perhaps in some way the long-term consequences of the dilution or the watering down of the left's traditional economic profile, that is to say, a wariness of capitalism, prioritization of constraining its negative consequences. And then the flip side of that is that right-wing populist parties proved to be extremely effective in turning a lot of the suffering and grievances that came out of not just the financial crisis, but the negative consequences of neoliberal capitalism over time, again, that we talked about, growing inequality, insecurity, deepening rural-urban divides, in shifting the blame for that to a combination of out-of-touch elites, highly educated people like ourselves who had been running the show, and immigrants and minorities who were taking a disproportionate share of the resources and not playing by the rules of the game, and were therefore also partially to blame for the suffering and the insecurity that other citizens were increasingly subject to, from the early 21st century, and particularly from the financial crisis on.
Yeah, earlier I've asked you actually about reactions to communism in the Soviet Union, particularly because when it comes to criticisms of capitalism, it seems that nowadays, I mean, even here in Portugal, we still have the Communist Party, and we have another left-wing party that is very close to the communist one, what in English would probably be the leftist bloc, where even in its origins, it had even Maoists and Stalinists there. So you see how far they would go, at least originally. Now, not so much. But even when here people try to make even the tiniest positive comments on the former Soviet Union or refer to Marx and people like that, I mean, it gets a really bad rap nowadays, because people associate it immediately with dictatorship and the gulags and all of that. So,
right. The other thing that's important to note, to sort of get back to a little bit to that previous question, is that those right-wing populists were also, in addition to being very skilled at kind of turning resentment and frustration towards elites and immigrants, also taking advantage of the the left's kind of watering down or dilution of its economic profile during the early 21st century, and particularly around the time of the financial crisis, really shifted their own economic profiles. So, when the first wave of these parties, right-wing populist parties, that is to say, emerged in the late 20th century, they tended to have kind of Thatcherite, Reaganite, neoliberal economic profiles, small state, cuts to the welfare state, lower taxes, all these kinds of things. But, as the left shifted to the center, and as many of, many low income, low educated voters, people who were suffering a lot from, again, globalization, changes in capitalism, changes in trade, as those people began to kind of shift away from left-wing parties, these right-wing populists realized that there was a great opportunity for them to capture these voters and more generally to capture a lot of the resentments that were growing in society. So, one of the other palpable trends of the early 21st century in Western Europe, this would actually later happen in Eastern Europe as well, is that these right-wing populist parties began to change their own economic profile. So they began to criticize globalization. They began to criticize free trade. They became advocates of what is sometimes referred to as welfare chauvinism. That is to say, we favor a strong welfare state, but only for, native-born citizens. They favor a strong state, a strong national state that can both fight back against, international economic trends as well as international whatever organizations and forces that are trying to, get our countries to, engage in practices that are not helpful for our own citizens. So these right-wing populist parties really changed their own economic profile to make themselves into much more viable critics of what you might consider to be whatever, neoliberalized, globalized capitalism. And this is a large part of the story of their success, and a large part of the story of why voting patterns and party systems have also really changed in Western Europe over the past decades.
So you mentioned globalization there, and on the side of the left, how have people been thinking about globalization and dealing with it theoretically and so on? I mean, what do leftist people, particularly nowadays, have to say about globalization?
Well, globalization is a big word. And, it can mean a lot of different things. I mean, there was generally a sort of embrace of globalization, both socially and economically, as we've already talked about in the 1990s. That is to say, the idea that, a sort of more globalized capitalism, a more open trade system, all those kinds of things, that was generally a good thing. But also going along with, free flow of trade and goods and financial flows and all these kinds of things also came, obviously, a greater flows of citizens or people back and forth across borders. And that was also, to a significant degree, embraced by the left during the late 20th century. And, this has obviously also generated something of a backlash, right? Because as we've had really massive immigration flows in Western Europe and also in the United States, where we've had some experience in the past in the US with massive immigration flows, although there's been really a huge jump over the past decade or decade and a half. I mean, that aspect of globalization, the freer movement of people, as well as the freer movement of goods and money, has also created a whole variety of challenges and problems, not just for the left, but for Western societies more generally, because dealing with all of these people often coming from really difficult backgrounds is a huge financial challenge, a huge social challenge. And, again, it has created a lot of problems, as well as obviously a backlash that folks on the populist right were able to take advantage of.
So something I haven't asked you directly about yet is fascism. And with the a current rise of the right-wing populism. People are worried about the possible return of fascism across Europe and elsewhere. So, what is exactly the relationship between populism and fascism?
So great. Another really important question. So, I mean, look, oftentimes these terms are conflated. And I
Mhm.
think that that is understandable, but somewhat dangerous. To my mind, fascism means something very specific. It's obviously linked to movements that appeared in Europe during the interwar years. These were anti-democratic movements, very anti-democratic movements. They were illiberal movements. They were overtly racist movements. They were revolutionary. They were violent, inherently violent. They, included paramilitary units. They were very willing to use violence against their own citizens, as well as in many cases internationally. Fascism, I mean, means something very specific. It doesn't just mean, we don't like immigrants. It doesn't
Mhm.
just mean we don't like elites. It doesn't just mean, we have criticisms of real existing democracy. It means something very specific, right? So I'm very hesitant to use that term lightly, and I'm very, very hesitant to conflate fascism in any movement or party that is on the right. So I want to just state that sort of openly right up front. When we look at right-wing populist parties in Europe, across Europe today, I think we see a very broad continuum. Some of these parties have become over time what I would actually consider to be more national conservative in a way than even right-wing populism. So if we look at
Mhm.
something like, Marine Le Pen's National Front, National Rally, that party has moderated really quite a lot since the time when it was run by her father. He was an open Holocaust denier, openly racist. His commitments to the democratic rules of the game were very unclear, right? To gain power, to gain legitimacy, to gain more voters, she has the daughter, in addition to overthrowing her father in a kind of palace coup, has very much tried to de-demonize that party, and she has really shifted its positions in a very significant way. She is not anti-democratic, at least openly. She has traded her father's open racism and anti-Semitism for criticisms of immigration that really focus on A, assimilation, and B, economic concerns. So this is a party that is conservative in some ways, not in others. Like I said, on economics, it is not conservative at all. It is a nationalist party in the sense that, it is very wary of immigration and very much for national sovereignty. I would not characterize that party in its current form as anti-democratic at all. And so I think conflating that, the contemporary national rally with fascism is a very big mistake, not only because it's really confusing the phenomenon, but it indicates very different ways of dealing with it. When you are dealing with a fascist party, a party that is absolutely committed to overthrowing democracy by violence if necessary, the kinds of means that you would use to fight that party are very different than the kinds of means that I think are legitimate to use to fight back against a party like the National Rally. Now, there are parties in Europe that are clearly anti-democratic. There's a bunch of them, as we alluded to earlier, in Eastern Europe, parties that have, are not interested in playing by democratic rules of the game, that have tried to undermine the democratic rules of the game successfully in Hungary, semi-successfully in Poland. I still would not consider those parties fascist, although they are clearly anti-democratic. There are parties that are anti-democratic in Western Europe. The AfD is the most obvious one, but there's really quite a broad range of parties in that or under that right-wing populist rubric. And there are not that many of them that I would term fascist, although some of them have questionable commitments to democracy, and then others do not. I mean, we have had right-wing populist parties in power in many West European countries, in Denmark, obviously now in Italy. They've been part of governing coalitions, Denmark, Finland, and other places. And there has been no democratic erosion. There may have been some shift in policies, but no democratic erosion. And so, really thinking about these parties under the framework of fascism, I think is really quite misleading.
And what can we do to avoid democratic erosion?
Well, what we can do to avoid democratic erosion is to have democratic parties and politicians, that is to say, people who are committed, parties who are committed to democratic rules of the game, solve the problems that their citizens are facing. I mean, we have some real challenges in Europe and in the United States. Economic challenges, which we've already mentioned, growing inequality, slow growth, increasing economic insecurity, growing divergences between, again, rural and urban areas, and again, huge demographic changes in many Western European societies, incredibly large numbers of immigrants. And obviously, immigrants can be an incredible source of strength, not only economically, but socially, right? Diversity is a potentially great thing, but governments have to be able to deal with these challenges. They have to show people that diversity means stronger economies, more attractive societies, and that requires policies to integrate people, to provide them with jobs, to provide them with education, to not make citizens feel like they are competing with each other for resources. And when governments deal with the challenges that their societies face, there's less dissatisfaction, there's less resentment, and therefore fewer people who are willing to vote for parties that claim the establishment is corrupt, the system is corrupt, and we should just blow the whole thing up. So, I mean, ultimately, dealing with populism and dealing with democratic decay means that mainstream parties and committed Democrats, small d Democrats, people who are committed to democracy, really need to look at the kinds of grievances people have, the challenges their societies face, and come up with viable and attractive solutions to those challenges. If they do so, then the constituency for populism will decline and dissatisfaction with democracy will dissipate.
So let me ask you one last question then, and talking again about leftism, since we started our conversation by talking a little bit about the history of the left throughout the 19th, 20th, and then 21st centuries. How do you look at the future of leftism, particularly looking at the main current challenges that we have to deal with?
So I would say Western societies, and in that I mean Europe, the United States, Canada, whatever, that we really face two main challenges, and they're not new challenges, but they have a new form. The first challenge is the challenge we began by talking about, which is the challenge of capitalism. Capitalism is the best system that we have so far for generating economic growth and innovation, which we all need, societies need. But it has also some very, very dangerous tendencies and consequences, both from an economic perspective and from a social and political perspective, right? And what we've seen, I think, since the 1990s was that the balance between sort of capitalism and the state was out of whack. Capitalism grew increasingly, so to speak, unconstrained, and the negative consequences of that were really quite dire. So, I mean, I think the first challenge that we face is figuring out, once again, how to maximize capitalism's upsides. We want to generate growth, we want to generate innovation, but we need to minimize its downsides. We cannot have severe economic dislocations and crises. We cannot have growing inequality. We cannot have growing insecurity. All of those things generate social divisions, political resentments, and they are just unsustainable. So the first challenge that we face, and the first challenge that I think the left should be at the forefront of dealing with, is the challenge of how to recreate that kind of balance between capitalism's upsides and downsides. The left lost the lead a little bit on that in the late 20th century, and figuring out how to sharpen its profile, how to put forward a program that is both attractive and effective for doing that thing, maximizing upsides, minimizing downsides. That is necessary both for successful left and successful democracy. The other great challenge is the challenge of diversity, right? Western societies are more diverse than they have been before. They are not only more diverse for the obvious reasons that we've had incredible amounts of immigration. If you look at some countries in Western Europe, Scandinavian countries, other countries, these are countries that have very little history of dealing with this kind of diversity. And they have changed demographically in an incredible way in the last several decades. This is an incredible challenge. It has not been sufficiently thought through or dealt with by either the left or other mainstream parties. But it's not just that diversity comes from immigration. In a wonderful way, since the 1960s, societies have become more diverse in the sense that women and other minorities have demanded full and equal rights, that they should be incorporated as full and equal citizens without discrimination and without prejudice in all of the rights of citizenship. And this is an important, indeed very positive change, but again, one that requires adaptation and bringing citizens along, right? So dealing with this challenge of diversity, the challenge and incredible promise of pluralism, this is the other great challenge of the 21st century, one that I think that the left is again uniquely positioned to deal with, but has lost, I think, a little bit of the thread over the last couple of decades, but absolutely needs to be thinking about how to, again, reconcile diversity and democracy, just as we need to reconcile capitalism and democracy. These are the two great challenges. They are not new challenges, but they have reemerged, I think, in a very powerful way in the last few decades, and they really will determine, I think, both the future of the left and the health of democracy in the years to come.
So if listeners and viewers are interested in learning more about the topics we explored here today, where can they find you and your work on the internet?
Well, I mean, I'm an academic, so I can be easily found just by Googling my name. I have a website that has links to my books and to my articles. And there are actually, in addition to myself, obviously, an incredible number of scholars and organizations working on these topics. On the topic, for instance, of how to manage 21st century capitalism, I would say that over the last decade or two, particularly since the financial crisis, there has actually been an explosion of promising progressive work on this topic out there. And so much more hopeful on new policies, new approaches to dealing with capitalism than I would have been before. And there's just lots of great work out there on these topics that hopefully people will read and think about and use when they decide how to vote and how to try to influence policies in their own countries.
So, Dr. Berman, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you very much.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Erga Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingburg, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Costa, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Jos Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.